Hi there, Frank Winston here for the Pacifica Historical Society, host of the weekly show Footprints of Pacifica, where we discover and explore the lure and lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. But tonight we meet with a personality who is a long-time resident. It's Lydia Azevedo, and she has contributed so much to the city of Pacifica. And I want to welcome you to the studio and have you share with us some of the background of yourself and your role in Pacifica. First, going to yourself, you did not grow up in Pacifica, so where are you from?
No. I was born in San Francisco, as was my mother 44 years before me. However, the stock market crashed only a few months after I was born, and that made living in the big city quite challenging. I actually lived there and attended Mission High School. It was a public high school, and graduated from San Francisco State College in the early 1950s. I was hired to teach school in the state capital, Sacramento, but I kept returning to San Francisco as my liberty town. I had been active in the Roman Catholic Newman Club while in college, and we started an alumni branch about the time I graduated.
The Newman Club is for students on campus, but then you created something for a fellowship of those who had been in Newman Club.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes. And
anything unusual happen in that?
Well, I went to my first national convention and was elected president of the alumni club, the first president. So I was kind of shocked. Because of that office, I went to an area meeting in San Jose and met my future husband over the Newman's Hall pool table. He actually taught me to play, well, at least to start learning how to play pool.
You want to confess that you tried to learn to play pool so you could meet him better?
No, I had no idea I was going to meet him, and I never did learn to play pool. He was a better pool player than I was.
And so when did you move to Pacifica from there?
Well, what happened was that I was teaching school in Sacramento, but Paul and I started going together, and after 7 years teaching, he asked me to marry him. We moved to Walnut Creek, where he was working.
What kind of work did he do?
He was a newspaper advertising man. That was his degree from San Jose State. And before we'd been there a year, the owner of the paper fired everybody, including Paul and the owner's own son. He cleaned the house. And Paul found a job with the Daily Pacific Builder, and he had to fly all around California, in an airplane, I might say, and sell ads. And at the same time, we were, by then, we had moved to, well, we had a baby while in San Francisco, figured that the little wooden back porch over a 3-foot drop to the cement below was not the place to raise a baby.
A little dangerous.
We looked for a house in San Francisco. The only house we could afford on his GI Bill was condemned before we got there. We called a real estate man and said, "Why did you recommend that?" He says, "Hey, on your GI Bill, the only place you can afford to live is Pacifica." We came down to Pacifica, found a house, had another kid or two, and Paul had started the Democratic Club in Walnut Creek. So he went to a Democratic convention, and he hitched a ride with Joe Fulford, who was some kind of an officer. Well, he gets a telephone call from Bill Drake, who was the publisher and editor of the Pacific Tribune, and he said, "I'd like to come by and talk to you about the convention." And he said, "I apologize for calling after 9 o'clock at night, but I've been selling advertising all this time." And Paul said, "Oh, I know what you mean. I'm an advertising salesman." The rest is history. The conversation changed. That's how we came. In other words, we were in Pacifica, but that's how he came working for the Tribune. Believe me, he didn't like flying around the state of California selling ads. He'd rather walk into some guy's office and sell him an ad in the Trib.
So when you settled here, Were either of you then active in the state Democrats and or the local Democrats? Because in Walnut Creek you had that.
Well, he was, see, that he had just joined the Democrats and he went with Joe Fulford to that convention. Right. And, but I was busy taking care of kids. I had 4 kids in less than 6 years. Believe me, I was busy.
Okay.
And,
but you did get active in some of the community activities, including the Democrats, the AUW.
Oh, yes. I've been treasurer in practically every organization I belong to. And
why'd you end up as treasurer?
Because I'm a math major.
Ah.
And it makes sense.
Sure, sure.
Anyway, Paul, the interesting thing about the Tribune was that Paul was in charge of everything they had. In other words, he worked in circulation. Our kids were inserters. Our kids delivered routes. I delivered complaints. So the Tribune became our life. It was quite interesting.
And what are these activities that you were involved in back then, as far as you said the Democrats, and then were you involved in the AUW, active there? Yes,
well, it was very interesting that we got a call from what do they call it, welcome wagon lady. Mm-hmm. And she said, I wanted to know if you were interested in any organization. Then she had a whole spiel, and I told her, oh yes, Democrats, we wrote that down. And she mentioned the university women. Now, I had been to a couple of meetings up in Sacramento when I was teaching with the university women, but they were all formal gatherings, and you had to have a date in order to go. Mm-hmm. I didn't know anybody up there, so I didn't join. Well, down here, she said, hey, we put an ad in the paper. You want to join? Come join us. So I joined the university women and was very active in that. We both were active in the Democrats. We joined the Historical Society when we found out about it.
When you say we, that Paul and
Paul
yourself.
And I, yes.
And then you became extremely active, and Paul was the leader of the Historical Society.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, we have from the archives of the Pacifica Historical Society some film clips and videos of Paul and others in that activity. So if we could roll the tape right now, please.
Our topic is the Historical Society. You're both members. In fact, I'm also a member. It's an organization which I don't really know too much about its actual inception and such, and
well,
maybe you can fill us in.
It's existed since sometime in the 70s, and we have to complete our own historical record to get that date pinned down, but it's been interrupted. Its activities were interrupted for a while, for a few years, and it's been continuously going for over 10 years now. Our primary purpose is to maintain a record of the history of Pacifica. We're also interested in preserving relevant artifacts and buildings. We're an official agency of the city of Pacifica, but we're all volunteer efforts, so we are not a burden on the taxpayers. Our main purpose, I guess you would say, a reason for being in this activity is that we believe that the past illuminates the future.
And Pacifica has quite a past. We're looking at the section of Pacifica, well, what's now the Sharp Park section of Pacifica, but that then was...
that was Salada Beach. Over here is Brighton Beach. Here is the Little Brown Church. And over there, right there, is a house at 185 Carmel, which still is there. And of course, there is the railroad train coming down the track.
The original Ocean Shore Railroad.
The Ocean Shore Railroad.
Which ran there through 1920 or so.
This is about 1912, and the church is in better shape right then. Here, this building right here is actually on what is now Palmetto Avenue. Then it was County Road, and it was called the Salada Hotel. The Sacy Bone Beauty Salon is in the building now. And you would not know from its appearance that this is a building that dates back to the Ocean Shore Railroad days.
It's amazing to see how much of the ocean is visible in this view compared with if we looked at the same view today. There are so many more buildings there.
Well, you have houses here, you have houses over here, and you have buildings along the street. It was pretty thin. But then we have Portola, who arrived in November 1769, went up on Sweeney Ridge and saw the big bay that the Indians knew was here all along. Then we have Sanchez, who became the owner of almost all of what is now Pacifica. Actually, more land than is in Pacifica, 9,000 acres.
There's a Mexican land grant.
He had the Mexican land grant, Rancho San Pedro. And then our history continues with the farmers from 1850 on, Michael Comerford, Robert Inches, people like that, some of whom had gone from the United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland, etc. They'd gone from there to Australia and then to California, which means they'd gone 3/4 of the way around the world in order to get to here. And
then we turn the century and
you turn the century just 100 years ago, and somebody got the idea for a railroad. Well, there was one man before that. There were two places. Morey's Point was owned by the Morey family. They had something going here before 1900. Ernst Danman had a property out on Pedro Point. He built a hotel there in 1908, but he was there since 1879. So here is a man who lived to be 98 years old and who was here from the time he was 21. Not bad.
right.
And, okay, but anyway, the history of the area essentially starts, except for the farmers, it starts with the Ocean Shore Railroad.
It's from the railroad that we got the little communities that we began to know today, Valamar, Rockaway, and some of these others.
Edgemar, Salada Beach, Brighton Beach, Valamar, each with a distinctive history and a separate history. Rockaway Beach, Pedro Point, or I guess they called it Tobin. The Tobin family was down here in the 1900s. This was the 1800s, I should say, the 19th century. They came down here and they bought up a lot of the old Rancho San Pedro. And then there was General Kirkpatrick, who bought the Sanchez adobe and made it his home and his wife's home, his widow's home, after he died.
Some people in the early 50s, after the developments after World War II started, began to feel a need to somehow join these smaller communities into a larger political entity?
You know, it's hard to realize that in 1909, the entire population of San Mateo County was about 12,000. So Redwood City didn't amount to much. Daly City wasn't even started until 1911 or thereabouts. So obviously this was a thinly populated coastal area as part of that 12,000. Half Moon Bay existed as a small community with Portuguese and Italian immigrants. When the Ocean Shore Railroad was put through, there were the Presbyterian Church, the San Francisco Presbytery, came down here and built 3 churches. They built what became the Little Brown Church. They built one in Moss Beach, and they built one in El Granada, or what was then called Granada.
So this would be an ideal building for such a museum, partly because the building itself is a historical landmark to be.
It's a historical landmark. When the police bought the building, or when the city bought the building for the police department in 1983, they made very careful plans to avoid destroying its historical value. They were very careful at that time.
We have a few photos that we'll be able to show the audience of the building, and Paul, you'll be able to point out some aspects of it.
Well, this is the Little Brown Church in, it says 1908, and it's just starting construction. 1910 was the year that it was actually completed and put into use. But so 1908, 1909, somewhere along in there. it's kind of faded, vague.
The railroad ran right in front of it, so to
Right,
speak? Or?
the railroad is out here, here's the horse, here's the railroad. And this is the side entrance, which brings up a point that the building has been changed from time to time. And so we're hoping to get it back to as much like the original as possible.
And that was that was Paul Azevedo, and Lydia is with us now. And if you go back to those days, not of the Little Brown Church, because that pre-existed, as he mentioned, but the Historical Society and its role, and specifically your role in the Historical Society. How active did you become?
Well, I'm not sure that I was terribly active in the Historical Society, aside from being the treasurer. But I've been asked a question that I found interesting. They say, well, why is the Little Brown Church the building you're looking at? And the very interesting point, because it was owned by the city when they turned it into a police station. Now, you don't make friends by saying, oh, that's a nice building, let's turn that into a museum, and whoever owns the building is standing there, huh? That's my home. You know, and here you have a building that had a history and was owned by the city. They bought it and turned it into the police station because it was for sale, evidently. Turned it into the police station, it was used, and then when they built the new police station, what are they going to do with it? Well, why not turn it into a museum?
The city didn't decide to turn it into a museum.
Oh, no. On the other hand, they hadn't expressed what they were going to do with it after the police station was built. But we made a suggestion, let's turn it into a museum.
And so there was a campaign involved, and
Yes.
you were active in that campaign.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And so was Paul, and it was rational. In other words, it was owned by the public. It wasn't, we weren't taking somebody's personal private property.
Well, if it's so rational, why did it run into some obstacles? Who didn't want to see it converted or even left existing? Some wanted to tear it down.
I don't know. Some people said that it was not
Fit or
historic enough. One of the problems, we did apply for a state, for a
National Trust recognition, landmark.
not national, state. And one of the problems was the only pictures that were sent in were pictures today. If they had shown pictures of when it started and pictures a little later and a little later, you would have seen it did not change that much. But when you only send pictures in the year, the 90s and the 2000s, they say, well, that's what it looks like today. And they don't compare it. We have a picture that is that long, and the church is in the middle, and the train, it's the one Paul was talking about. That shows it was here, it was running, and so on. So it's an old building.
Well, it sounds like you and Paul worked together on that issue, but at least there was one time in your life where you and Paul were not quite on the same side. And I want you to tell us a little about that, because most of us in Pacifica have heard of Devil's Slide.
Yes.
But not all of them have heard of the various projects and the ideas of what we should do to get around Devil's Slide.
Well, the thing is that Paul was an advertising newspaper man, and his idea was business. And he's right. Without business, you can't really function. And he was very concerned about keeping businesses open and having customers coming. And when the Devil's Slide was out, it made a difference to the people in Pacifica and to the people in Half Moon Bay. So the idea for the bypass was brought up, and he thought that was a good idea. That's a highway.
So that the highway would now not be affected by any slide because you'd be above it or around it.
Yes. The difference was that a lot of people did not realize how far back in Lindemar Valley the bypass was going to go. It was going to go from basically the end of Perez. Now that's way back in the valley, and it was going to be rather steep because of the height of the two mountains. And in fact, they had to cut a gouge across the top between the two mountains to lower it so that they could keep within the highway limitations. And then I happen to be a mathematician, okay, that's my training. And when I looked at the map and saw that only 18% of the highway built on a shale mountain was going to be on the ground.
Solid, yeah.
Yes. The rest of it, 82% between here and the crest of the mountain, was going to be on fill up to 200 and 300 feet deep. And I said, I don't want to be up there on that mountain when the shale starts shaking and so on.
I think you were ahead of the times because today the political line is always do the math. Well, you were doing the math at that time, but you didn't have a supporter in your family. At least Paul was on the absolute opposite side of the issue. How did that come about?
He was, but because he was for the bypass. And I had been a Sierra Club member for a while, and I went to a Sierra Club meeting, and I didn't usually go to the meetings, didn't speak up, and I said, you know, we got to do something about this thing. And I spoke up, and they said, that's not a Sierra Club issue. You got to deal with that in Pacifica. And somebody in the back of the room said, well, if you want a meeting, you can meet at my house on Pedro Point. And somebody else said, oh, I'll chair a meeting. So we came up with a date, we announced a meeting, and we started a group. I can't even remember the four-letter word that we
acronym.
The acronym. I can't remember the acronym.
Okay.
But I became the treasurer.
You always became the treasurer.
Yeah. And
but you had a different view of what to do.
We got a ballot issue, and as I recall, it was 74% of the vote.
But it wasn't to vote down the bypass, it was to vote in your
For
idea.
the tunnel. For
Okay.
the tunnel.
I want to show the picture here for the audience, and if you could point out in particular the one that he's focusing
Well,
on. Can you see it? Do you want me to bring it close? Yeah, that's fine.
the point is, people think that the Devil's Slide is over here, but they didn't realize that see, I lose my words, that the highway would be all the way back here.
The bypass.
The bypass would go all the way back there. It would come at Perez. Perez is way back in the valley. There would be noise. They had big runway, what they call for trucks running away. So they were expecting that. They were going to have a real gradual slope up to the highway. No lights on the highway, just headlights. And the deer could very easily get up there and be romping around on the road. It would have been quite something to be up there.
Well, people who have moved recently to Pacifica know about the tunnel and Devil's Slide, but how long has it been that the people have been trying to find a solution to the transportation issue, and when will it be built is another question, but they're working on it now.
Now, wait a minute. There was the Chronicle and the
San Mateo Times?
The Argus both had front page stories that the tunnel is beginning. So in this last month, they had.
You're talking about the Tribune.
No, I'm talking about the San Francisco Chronicle.
Yeah, but
and
you mentioned the Argus.
Well, see, I don't live here anymore.
Right.
My paper over there is the Argus.
Okay, you live in the East Bay now.
After Paul passed away
Okay.
and I sold the house, I moved over to be closer to my children.
But when was the campaign that you got the 74% for the tunnel?
I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was a while ago. It has been a ways. It has been quite a while.
All right. Now, also going back to the Democrats and the like, when you were active in that club, did you people did the Democrats take a position on the tunnel? Did you incorporate other associations or just civic grassroots groups?
I don't recall that they didn't particularly get involved in that. I don't recall that there was. No, it was just logical to some of us when we saw the
You've
numbers
you've
in the
convinced
highway.
me that you should have had a 94% vote from the way you've described it. You were really involved. I think you were involved more than just as a treasurer.
Well-
There's a passion there.
Well, my children say it was really funny driving around town with both bumper strips, bypass and tunnel on the car.
Was that to save the family? You had double stickers?
I don't know.
Did it bother you that you were advocating for the opposition?
No, as long as mine was there, I was willing to go along with the other idea, because my idea was more intelligent.
And you will live to see that idea come to
Yes,
fruition.
yes.
They're working on it now.
Yes.
Have you been invited to be involved in any of the plans for when they do open the tunnel?
No, and I'm not expecting to be.
Well,
I'm satisfied with my participation and my activities.
Well, maybe that should be on the agenda of the Pacifica Historical Society, that when the day comes that the tunnel is open and the public is invited, Lydia Azevedo, our guest tonight, would be joining us for that event. Would you come back from the East Bay for that event?
I'm here tonight just to be on the show with you, sir.
The Footprints of Pacifica, of course, that's
This is
very
more
much so.
important than any old tunnel being opened.
But you were also on some of these shows before. You were never on TV in Channel 8 and Channel 26. This is your first appearance?
As far as I remember.
You were a star. You've done marvelous. We're happy you were here, and I'll be sure to see that you come back for that ceremony. And to the audience, if you want to contact the Pacifica Historical Society, P.O. Box 752, and pacificahistory.org is the website. This is Frank Winston signing off. Remember, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. And departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.